Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine's newest AI innovation, Motific, is bridging the gap between concept and deployment. Motific accelerates deployment from months to days while reducing GenAI security, trust, compliance, and cost risks. Motific provides advanced policy controls to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data and helps ensure compliance throughout the entire process. Move beyond the constraints of traditional AI implementation. Visit Motific AI to learn more. That's motific.ai.
Hi, I'm Johna Till Johnson, CEO of Nemertes, and I am here with my co-host, John Burke, CTO of Nemertes. And you're listening to Heavy Strategy, the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. And in that spirit, on today's show, we are actually going to be debating something that many of you may be considering heresy, which is whether or not it has come time to ditch Microsoft from your enterprise environment. I will make the case that it's due to security concerns. So with that, John, let's go ahead and get started. You ready for this one?
Oh, of course. I was born ready.
Okay. So here is the stance that I would take, and I'm not just taking it hypothetically. We've issued a number of our advisories to clients saying, essentially, Microsoft has now gone past the point of being a general vulnerability to the point where enterprise users should really reconsider whether they want to use Microsoft at all for their corporate applications. And what I'm talking about is a couple of weeks back, the President, Brad Smith, was actually presenting to Congress and essentially defending Microsoft to Congress in the US, saying, yes, we have made some mistakes. We have some vulnerabilities. Sorry about that whole thing where we introduced a massive vulnerability into the Department of the Treasury. But hey, we're trying to make things better. And that was literally his speech. I was listening to it. One of the things, though, he did not say was things like, we will make it better. In fact, one of the things I called him out on was a claim multiple times that he would hope that things would improve. Well, that to me does not sound like what a president says when they're planning to take action to make something improve. That sounds like passing the buck. And it's at the point where U.S. senators, both Democrat and Republican, have said, we are actually recommending that government agencies pause their deployment of Microsoft and think about it. And just to give you a little bit of background about what the it is that I'm talking about. If you look at the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, which keeps a current list of all vulnerabilities for organizations and individuals, the far and away, the operating system with 60% more vulnerabilities than runners up is Microsoft, which has a whopping 205 vulnerabilities for its operating system. It's got 28 for Active Directory, 44 for Microsoft 365, which is absolutely freaking bonkers. These are known vulnerabilities in its software that are going into your desktop, in your cloud, and in your directory. If that were not enough, Microsoft has also taken steps in its recent licensing over the past 2 years to make your existing enterprise license less secure. What do I mean by that? Microsoft E3 actually included a lot of APIs and integrations with third-party security vendors. What Microsoft ended up doing was taking those out of E3 and telling customers that they had to upgrade to E5, which is 60% more expensive, in order to get the integrations that they already had with third-party security vendors back. And one of the things that caused me to really blow a gasket while I was listening to Brad Smith, the president, talk about this was when he said, I am unaware of any bundling processes that Microsoft has taken that make Microsoft less secure. And I'm listening to this saying to myself, dude, you should not be running a hot dog stand if you truly are unaware, because that is a major, major shift you've made and it really affects your enterprise users. And if you don't know that you did that, that's culpably ignorant. And if you do know that you did that and you're lying to Congress, that's criminal. So pick one, guys. But either the guy is culpably ignorant or he's criminal. And this is your cybersecurity that he is holding in his hands. And my last comment before I toss it over to you, John, to make some of your points is let's think about this for just 10 seconds here. The SEC in the United States has said that if you get attacked, if you get a breach, that is something that you have to actually report to the SEC. You have to report publicly. And that's true whether your breach comes in from AD, whether it comes from Azure, whether it comes from Teams. It doesn't really matter. You still have to report it. So essentially, Microsoft is saying, we know there's a lot of vulnerability. We sort of hope someone somewhere who isn't us is going to fix it. We've actually taken steps to make your Enterprise 3 license software less secure, but use us anyway. Go ahead, John, tell me why.
Number one reason is, of course, that almost everybody is already using it. If you look around the enterprise, 95 out of 100 of the Fortune 100 are using Azure for their cloud platform or one of their cloud platforms. 80% of the Fortune 500 are using Office 365 or Microsoft 365, they call it now, for their online office apps and file storage and so forth. And depending on whose numbers you look at, 90% or more of enterprise desktops are Windows machines. They are everywhere. And, they have gotten to the point in cybersecurity where, with endpoint protection being a leading product for them and other things, especially for like DLP in their cloud environments, adding on, they're pulling 20 billion in cybersecurity revenues. It's like 8% of market share, and that's pretty solid. It's hard to believe that so much money would be coming from so many very tech-savvy companies in the Fortune 100 and the Fortune 500 if they were truly terrible at doing the job of cybersecurity. Now, I will underscore a major proviso here, and that is a lot of what they're fixing is problems that exist in their own platforms. And that is a huge and important consideration. But if you're looking at them for cybersecurity services, well, golly, they're well positioned to provide them. They're providing good versions of them in at least several market categories. And they are in a uniquely good position to integrate with the desktop platform that almost everybody in the business is using, uniquely positioned to provide DLP in their own cloud environments, which almost everybody is using, and providing some key categories of software for the current moment, CASB systems, ID management, and security on ID management, all those things. So, reason number one is they are everywhere, and they are useful is reason number two. Now, you may not like the way their leadership is responding to the security crisis of the moment. I don't like the way their leadership is responding to the security crisis of the moment, but that's not about the product portfolio. And it doesn't affect the utility of that portfolio. That guy could go to jail for all I care, contempt of Congress, cool. But I'm still going to be running Defender on my desktops.
Well, okay, let me ask you that, John, because this is a debate you and I have long had. And for those of you who are listening, in all fairness, John has often been on the other side of this with me supporting being pro Microsoft. But I don't know that we've ever come to the right answer. But I keep looking at all the things that Microsoft does. And when it comes down to it, what does Microsoft do? Well, collaboration and email. So that's Teams. And a lot of enterprises use Teams, right? We know that, like whatever it is, 70% of enterprises use Microsoft Teams. Fine. It's almost as good as Zoom, I would say. Not quite. Microsoft has always had problems optimizing network bandwidth. It just doesn't seem to understand the idea that the world isn't a giant LAN. And that stuff actually has to go over some bandwidth constrained or latency intensive links, and that your video software actually has to accommodate that. But never mind. So Teams is kind of second best, at least second best. And I'm not picking favorites. Maybe there's a better, you have a favorite collaboration app, but nobody's favorite collaboration app is Teams. I can tell you that. So there's that. Then what else do they have? Well, they have operating systems. That's kind of the devil you know. I won't say anybody's going to pound the table and say Windows is the best operating system ever. People will say that about Mac. They'll say that, Mac OS. They'll say that about Linux. They will say, well, it mostly works for Windows. Azure is certainly very popular. It's a strong runner-up to AWS, and it may have some advantages over AWS. And Microsoft certainly makes it financially credible to use. But honestly, it's like number two in the cloud space as well. And we're starting to see a theme here, right? So when you get right down to it, the things that are keeping people addicted feeding their Microsoft addiction tend to be three things: Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. And of those three, I would say Google has got perfectly fine replacements for two of the three, Slides and Word. And the only thing remaining that Microsoft possibly does better than anyone else ever anywhere is Excel. So when you come right down to it, you're spending $50 million a year to give your employees a decent spreadsheet because only Excel has the incredible flexibility that it has, so that, and many folks are running their accounting on Excel, though they won't actually admit it, even the Fortune 500. So in my mind, Microsoft is not as good as the alternatives across the board, with the exception of Excel. And so just because everybody's using it because they make it financially irresistible doesn't mean it's a good idea.
I'm just going to push back on that on multiple fronts. And again, John is correct. I have taken the opposite side in this argument multiple times, mostly around the subject of Office, but even on Windows. I mean, we run on Macs. I converted us to Macs because the OS just runs and has remarkably few security problems. But I am not running a Fortune 500 company. I am not dependent on the interoperability of a host of applications that run on Windows and nowhere else. And I am giving due credence to the decisions of those hundreds and thousands of CIOs and CTOs and directors and managers of IT who have continuously judged that the pain of transitioning off of Microsoft far exceeds the pain of staying on Microsoft. And that, practically speaking, there's not a good enough reason to pull up all the stakes and pack the tent up and go find a new tent. Because sure, some of Google's tools are about as good as the equivalent Microsoft tools, but they're close. They're not perfectly substituting for it. And the pain of transition is not just the pain of shifting what you've licensed and what's installed where, if you are installing something. It's also retraining every single user in your company to use the new platform rather than the old. And the problem is not so much that they're hugely dissimilar as that a lot of folks are not great at adapting to new tools that are almost the same as their old ones, but not quite, because they keep getting tripped up by ingrained habits and expectations and, clicking the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, deleting things. So that transition is non-trivial. And likewise, the transition of your IT teams to being in support of these other platforms, massive retraining effort from top to bottom. Again, the pain of doing all of that, in most people's estimation, still far exceeds the pain of using the tools and dealing with the security problems they bring with them.
Well, I love the way you've laid that out, because that is the fundamental issue. And I think that's the reason we're talking about this right now, because pretty much if you're listening to this, the first thing you're thinking is Johna has gone nuts because it's way too complicated to move off Microsoft for my organization. So she's lost it. And John just said what makes perfectly good sense. Here's the problem with that. I actually remember the summer before Windows took over. And I can't tell you what year it was. It was in the early 90s, because I remember where I was, because I was visiting my parents. And my dad at that point was running training for a nuclear power plant. And he was also overseeing the technology selection. And his team had come to him and said, well, listen, we're doing computing and we need OS2 because, of course, we work for IBM. All of our computing is IBM. There's this upstart little company called Microsoft. Never really heard of them, but they're sort of buzzing around the periphery and they sound like they might be interesting. And that was in April, May. By the end of that summer, there had been almost a sea change where they didn't have CIOs then, but directors of IT everywhere had said, you know what? I'm going to go with Microsoft. What the heck? And there was this flip, and OS2 vanished into the sunset, and basically nobody ever uses it anymore, which is a very sad thing, but never mind. And the point is, the technology which is dominant and unthinkable to question suddenly becomes questionable at some point. And what I would politely say is this may be the point. So addressing your objections, John, one by one, your response is, look, whether Microsoft is as good as or almost as good as the competitors in each different area, collaboration, cloud, whatever, the pain of the change is going to be too great. And the pain of the change, you further on double clicked down and said it's the individual employees who are going to have to make a transition that they would suffer from. And this team training would make a transition they would have to come up to speed on whatever new thing you used. I'm going to maintain that we're at a generational shift that makes that actually less painful than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Because pretty much any kid you see today is at the very least bilingual Mac and Windows and very, very familiar with what's going on with Google and, very comfortable with FaceTime and Zoom. And pretty much anything out there, they get the general idea of how stuff works, so they're very comfortable with it. So while your older employees are going to suffer, those are the folks that are retiring. And maybe if they suffer enough to retire, that's not actually a bad thing. As an older person myself, I don't like saying that. But essentially, one needs to be resilient and resourceful and flexible to be successful in today's environment. So yeah. So I would say employees is going to be an issue that's less and less and less important over time. IT teams always going to be an issue, and I can't counter this. You're absolutely correct. It would be a major transition for your team's listeners. I think though the main thing that I would raise, you make the excellent point that the pain of transitioning is less than the pain of staying. I'm saying that equation may have flipped. And it may have flipped with the number of vulnerabilities that Microsoft has allowed, the depth of these vulnerabilities. I mean, you've got the freaking Department of the Treasury getting hacked because of Microsoft. That's kind of a big deal. And at some point, people are already going to jail. CSOs are already going to jail. If you're a CISO and you're listening to this, I'm telling you, man, do you really want to go to jail because your company thinks Microsoft is sacrosanct? Is that a logical decision for you?
Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine, merges innovation with the art of possible. A launchpad for transformative emerging tech, Outshift blends startup agility with corporate strength to develop next-gen technologies from the ground up in AI, quantum technologies, cloud native, and more. Their newest AI innovation, Motific, addresses a critical challenge in the rapidly advancing world of Gen AI, bridging the gap between concept and deployment. This model and vendor-agnostic solution supports the entire Gen AI journey from assessment and experimentation to production. Motific accelerates deployment from months to days while safeguarding against Gen AI security, trust, compliance, and cost risks, all while empowering business function and IT teams to rapidly configure end-user assistance powered by organizational data. Motific provides advanced, customizable policy controls to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data and helps ensure compliance throughout the entire process. With deep visibility into operational and business metrics, Motific enables you to track ROI, optimize costs, and make informed decisions. Move beyond the constraints of traditional AI implementation, utilizing AI deployment that is as responsible as it is revolutionary. Visit Motific AI to learn more. That's motific.ai.
I think that is a really good and valid point for folks to keep in mind. I will just say, though, that for the vast majority of users in any enterprise, and even the bulk of the IT department or cybersecurity department in any enterprise, this is all somebody else's problem and somebody else's pain. They're not feeling it because it hasn't happened to them. And so they're not going to make decisions based on the possibility of it happening because they haven't been making that decision based on that possibility for the last 20 years. I don't think the moment has come yet. It may just be one good internet worm away from happening to a large number of people rapidly enough to cause that pivot. And, you could see enterprises 5 years from now, 50% of them using Chrome desktops, or who knows what, just getting away from the idea of a fully empowered operating system on the endpoint at all. The dream of the terminal server comes back.
Oh, yes. Let's all go back to VT100s. Woohoo.
Hey, people rarely hacked a VMS system. It's all I'm saying.
I did, but let's not talk about that one.
Oh, I broke into one once too, but that was before security was a thing. I think that, yes, there's a pile of things happening that should give leadership at the top real pause if they're thinking about doubling down on their Microsoft commitment versus trying to spread out their investments and, maybe lean more on AWS on the cloud side instead of Azure. Maybe bring in some other tools to secure their systems so that it's not all about Microsoft. I think those are all valid conversations, and they're going to happen at some organizations high up, but I just don't see it being any more compelling this year than it was last year or the year before. And so I don't think folks are going to feel more compelled this year than last year or the year before. A lot of what you're talking about is like leadership stuff and other people's problems. Like, okay, it was a problem with your Microsoft stuff, but how come you didn't have the right protections around that? Why was somebody able to get to that, SSH port and break in through the regression bug? Why wasn't that blocked off, in your firewalls? Why wasn't that blocked off elsewhere?
So I'm going to jump in, John, because I will say that something fundamental has changed between this year and last year, which is the SEC reporting requirements. That is a biggie. And it may take a while for that ripple effect to go from top down as CISOs are mulling this over. But at the end of the day, what it does is make the CISO incredibly more expensive because he or she is incredibly more at risk. And as CISOs begin to internalize this and ask what they're worth, and all CISOs sort of start doing this, so you can't get somebody that doesn't ask for $10 million in escrow in case he has to go to jail. All of a sudden, you're going to sit here and go, you know what? I don't know. Microsoft doesn't seem like such a bargain after all. And that's the final point I want to zero back in on, which is Microsoft, like any other large vendor, like IBM in its time, like Cisco today, will lock you in and then make it so expensive to leave that you simply just, you've got the frogs slowly boiling as the temp gets heated up. The CFO is saying it would be so expensive to shift over all these laptops, and it would be so expensive to leave this E5 licensing. The problem with that is that Microsoft isn't giving you an apples to apples comparison. Like earlier, John, you mentioned that Microsoft Security, if it were its own company, would be a $20 billion cybersecurity company, which is not bad. As Ed Amoroso used to say, the CISO at AT&T used to make the point that if AT&T's cybersecurity offerings were a company, it would be like a $150 million company, or, not bad. And 20 billion is a lot bigger than 120 million. So, okay, cool. But the problem is you don't get like for like. When you were saying maybe consider external third-party cybersecurity, Microsoft will drive you and force you to use nothing but Microsoft. And that's the only way the math will work. You can see a savings on your cybersecurity if you drop all of your external systems and just use Microsoft. The problem is, despite that $20 billion of revenue, it's not clear at all that the cybersecurity is equivalent. In fact, it's almost certainly not. From what I've seen, feature functionality comparison, we've guided clients through this decision-making process, and it's always inferior. So essentially, Microsoft is running an extortion racket. They're saying, we are charging you $20 billion to fix the stuff that we injected into your environment, and we're teaching you that is a cost savings somehow. So I'm not saying one should. In fact, we try not in this podcast to give people recommendations. What I'm tossing out there is the idea of maybe daydream, consider, think what life would be like if you were to transition away from Microsoft. For one thing, your help desk requirements would probably drop.
I know ours did.
Ours went to basically zero. I mean, that was the reason we transitioned. Gosh, that sounds funny. No, we're still the original genders we had at birth, but from a platform perspective, we transitioned. And your cybersecurity incidents will likely go down. I say likely because I don't know what's going on in everybody's environment. And oh, by the way, if Zoom and Slack start getting hacked at the degree that, Windows is, who knows, right? Nobody can promise that. But it's worth looking at, if you're trying to make a business case for transitioning, you would look at the cost of the third-party cybersecurity solutions because Microsoft's capabilities in E5 do not meet the market standard. You look at support, you look at the cost of support, you look at the cost of cybersecurity incidences, and you look at the risk that you might be running with these massive vulnerabilities that you've got. And that might be a way to start chunking out something that you could say, okay, we're going to expand to Zoom or Slack, or as John, as you said, AWS, or maybe offer incoming employees their choice between a Mac OS and Microsoft and see how it goes. There's all different ways you can start a soft transition and see how it plays out and see if it's delivering you value. And the only thing I guess I would say is don't dismiss the idea out of hand, because it may be that the time has come, or if it hasn't come, it may be coming.
Let me throw in that if you are a small company with a small staff, or just getting started as a company, just building out your infrastructure in the first place, you especially should be thinking pretty hard about whether to bring Microsoft into the picture at all. You have more options than folks 10 years ago did to do things in a Microsoft-free manner. And even then, there were options and people did pursue them. So I think even though I don't think it adds up for most large companies yet, I'm not arguing with Johna. It may very soon, and it's best to be preparing for the possibility of the switch flipping. But for small companies, think 4 times before you decide to lean on Microsoft for something, because it's $1 a month cheaper to get O365 than it is to get Google Workplace. I don't think it is. I think
actually
price
isn't.
parity, but think real hard about what else you're going to be bringing in board when you make that decision, because it does have a lot of gravitational pull. It does pull a lot of things into its orbit.
Yeah, and I think that's basically the way to think about it. What we're really tossing out here are some things to think about and ways to tackle the strategic direction vis-a-vis Microsoft. And the main reason, John and I always like to do things at kind of a higher level of abstraction. Microsoft has been a sacred cow in so many organizations for so long that we've got a built-in internalized blind spot. And if nothing else, the most important thing you can do as a strategist is to continually question the sacred cows. And I'll give you guys an example that John is very well familiar with. Every time we made a decision about any software platform at Nemertes, for 15 years, I said, can it run disconnected? Because there are always environments where you're not on the internet, you will need to work. And if it doesn't have a disconnected mode, then we can't buy it. And one day I took that requirement off the list because we had hit the point where you were connected to the internet pretty much everywhere, even if you're driving down a road in North Dakota or, on a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You've got Starlink, you've got whatever. Well, you know what? At some point, technology causes you to rethink the sacred cow of, I need to always have a fallback in disconnected mode. And similarly, if one of your sacred cows happens to be Microsoft, the way you can tell is if you're listening to this and you really think it's heresy, then you probably want to revisit it. If you've thought about it and you kind of agree with John, like, I've thought through all these things and I think through it every year and I still don't think the time has come. Yeah, cool, fine. So I guess, John, you want to, any final thoughts on this before we wrap this one up?
That cow is no longer sacred. That is a profane cow.
Which is, that's one way to look at it. And no cows should ever be sacred. As much as I like cows, you really don't want them to be sacred unless you actually are Indian and they actually are sacred to you, in which case that's a good thing.
IP and Ethernet are sacred. I'm not sure much else is.
And that, John, is going to be the topic for another show. So thank you very much for joining us today. If you've got feedback or follow-up for us on the whole issue of sacred cows in general or Microsoft in particular, please send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. And you know what that stands for, right? Follow-up. We'd love to hear from you about your own experiences and opinions. And also, if you hit packetpushers.net, you'll find the Network Break podcast, which helps you stay current on the latest tech news and what it means. Very relevant as you grapple with issues of IT strategy and where to head. And there's also things like other tech and networking podcasts, cybersecurity podcasts, or newsletters, and a job board where you can find fantastic engineers for roles you're trying to fill or your next great role. And if you want to talk to either me or John, you can reach us at numerties.com. That's N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R-T like Thomas, E-S like Sam.com. And we really look forward to hearing from you, particularly if you vehemently disagree with something we've said here. But even if you just want to pat us on the back and say good job, that too.